Hello, Grace Bible Church. This is Pastor Jason here. I want to take a few minutes on this Thursday morning and address all of you as a church. But I know many of you who might be watching this video today might not be part of our church family, and that's okay. This is a message I want to give to our people and to anyone who might be watching during this turbulent time that we're facing as a nation, as a local people here in Lexington, and then really across our region. We're facing some times like we've never seen before. Our schedules have been thrown up in the air. Schools are canceled. People's works might even be being done remotely to home, or even maybe on some sort of a vacation at this particular time, a staycation, sort of staying home at the time. But whatever you might be facing now, I pray this brief little video might encourage you during this time that we're facing right now. The famous saying, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," was really first voiced by Franklin D Roosevelt in his presidential inaugural address in 1933. And this address was given during a most fragile time in our country. We were in the midst of the Great Depression. And the point of this saying by President Roosevelt was just really to highlight that if we allow fear to infiltrate our lives amidst many difficult things that they were facing, it's only going to make things worse. Listen, fear can really make matters worse in many situations. Fear can cause things to go from bad to terrible because we allow fear to dominate us. Fear can cause us to overreact and respond in irrational ways. In recent days, we've seen a little bit of this play out. Maybe you've been experiencing some of this too in where you live and what you're facing each day. People, running to the store and buying up and hoarding things because there is fear that they won't have their daily needs met. But I want us to think more critically about this. As Christians, we ought to have a perspective that calms our hearts. We ought to have a perspective of the world and the situation the world is in, and what God is doing in the world and what God is doing in our lives. And we ought to have that ought to have a calming effect in our hearts. Listen, I know in the midst of challenging times like these, I know there may be more to come. The question that really I want to answer is, what are we as believers to do? How are we to respond to this? Well, I believe there's a time to practice what we know to be true, and that's one of those places we're in right now. Paul, the Apostle Paul that is, in Romans 8:28 through 30, writes some verses that ought to bring some great comfort to our lives. Let me read those to you this day, and I'm just going to read verse 28. Listen to what Paul says. And he says, "And we know that God causes," listen to that, "we know that God causes all things to work together for the good of those who are called, for the good of those who love God, and to those who are called according to his purpose." Did you hear those words that Paul used? He's speaking about some realities that we need to understand a little more clearly in days like this. Paul here, really in verse 28 through 30, is laying out the believer's blueprint for his life, or really God's blueprint for our lives. In the context of Romans 8:28 to 30, God is speaking to us about the work of salvation that he is accomplishing in our lives. Paul is addressing a past aspect of our salvation. He's addressing a present aspect of our salvation and a future aspect of our salvation in these passages. But in verse 28, where I want to take us today, is Paul talking about a present reality in our salvation. Now, as we dive into verse 28, there are several truths that will emerge that I want to point you to. First and foremost, notice what verse 28 says. Listen to it. He says, "And we know." What is he saying here? Well, really what he is affirming is that Christians ought to know certain truths. He is saying that believers have a sanctified awareness a sanctified awareness that we know what God is doing in our lives. God is at work in our lives. Do you recognize that, believer, today, that God is actively at work in your life? He's using everything in your world for your good. God takes all that we face and uses it. And Paul is saying, and we know, a believer ought to know those specific truths. Listen, if we lose sight of that, if our thinking is short-circuited and we forget that God is at work in our lives, listen, fear undoubtedly will be in your heart. Anxiety will be your response. Worry will dominate your thinking. But if we remember, as Paul is saying here, and we know, if we have a settled thought pattern, Paul is saying it ought to have an effect of our life. So what are we to think? Well, he addresses that. Notice what he says. And we know that God causes all things. Listen, the believer ought to have a settled understanding that God is in complete control, that God causes all things. Listen, here we have a most comforting truth for us in times like this, that God is not asleep at the wheel, that God is not disconnected from his universe. Listen, Grace Bible Church, God is in control of all things. This ought to be, listen, the pillow we lay our heads on at night. This ought to be a truth that we anchor our souls to each and every day, not just during this coronavirus, but during any time in our life. Listen, what comfort this really is for the believer is enormous. But there needs to be a point of clarity made here about this passage. This does not mean that the believer is spared pain. This is not the believer being spared suffering or hardships. But what God does mean here when he says that he causes all things, even the good and the pleasant and the unpleasant, the sad and even the sufferings, listen to this, even the hardships, he has providentially using all of those things for his glory and our good. Did you hear that, believer? God causes all things to work together for good. Listen, he takes pain. He takes good tidings. He takes the loss of a job, the birth of a child, the celebration of that, the dark valleys we walk through, the high mountains we climb. He uses all of those things for our good. We need to see that. We need to see that God is so in control that he uses all things, everything we face, for his glory. There is no maverick molecules out there, as R.C. Sproul has rightly said in his lifelong ministry, pointing us all to the sovereignty of God. God is completely sovereign. That's what Romans 8:28 is saying, that he is completely sovereign in our sanctification. Listen, think of it like this. When a painter sets out to paint a picture, he has a palette of paints to choose from to paint a masterpiece. He pulls from shades of yellow and shades of green and shades of brown to construct a beautiful color that is used onto that canvas to make that masterpiece. Listen, Grace Bible Church, God is taking your life, adding a little good and a little suffering and a little pain and a little this and a little that, because he's causing all things to work together for your good. This is this third thing that Paul addresses here, and this really is the final thought of this verse, when he tells us in the last part of verse 28, when he says this, to those who are called according to his purpose. See, there's a purpose in God's plan. And we know this as Christians, and we know that God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Listen, believer, listen to me. God uses all events in our lives for our good. God is up to something in your life. God's ultimate purpose in your life is to make you like Jesus. Don't forget that. God is not here to make you happy. God is here to make you like Jesus. God is here to make you like Christ. You see, the true believer is moving down this road that we call spiritual growth. And down that road, there are some potholes and there are some smooth places. But all of that journey has one end point, and that is to be made like Christ. Grace Bible Church, whether you're facing insignificant things today or you're facing extreme matters today, may we rest in this truth that Paul's pointing us to, that he's using all these things for our good and for his glory. Dear friend, Romans 8:28 is God's blueprint for our lives. And may we use Romans 8:28 rightly during these uncertain times with this certain truth from God's Word. Listen, I pray this has been a blessing to you. If it has, please share it with someone. Just share it on your Facebook page and allow God to use this. And for the rest of us here at Grace Bible Church here in Lexington, let us use this truth that we've gained today to share it with a neighbor or a friend about what God is doing in our lives. Hey, we love you, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Be safe out there.